On this now sunny London morning. My name is Greg Fisher. I'm the Managing Director of Synthesis, which is a think tank I've set up with Paul Ormerod to take the sort of thinking on complex systems and networks into public policy. So that's who I am. So this first session is going to be a talk by Paul Ormerod for about 15 minutes. And then we'll have Hilton Root over there who will be responding to what Paul said. And then we'll have about sort of 40 minutes for Q&A. So without further ado, let me introduce Paul Ormerod. Paul is my co-director at Synthesis. He's also a visiting professor at Durham University and a partner in Volterra Partners. He's author of 3 best-selling books, as many will know, Death of Economics, Why Most Things Fail, and Butterfly Economics. Hilton Root is an academic and policy specialist in international political economy and development, and he's a member of the faculty at the George Mason University School of Public Policy. So thank you, Hilton, for flying over from the US to be here. I don't think he specifically came for this, but thank you anyway. Okay, so Paul's going to talk for 15 minutes, then Hilton will respond briefly, and then we'll have Q&A. Paul Ormerod.
Well, thanks very much, and good morning. So I've got a short time, so I'm going to have to make some generalizations. But it seems to me, if we look at the conduct of economic and social policy throughout the West since the Second World War, its intellectual basis is that of agents responding to incentives. If we want to achieve an aim, we change taxes, we change subsidies, we change regulation, and agents mean decision makers, individuals, companies acting autonomously on their own making up their own minds will respond and will achieve certain aims. Now the model is not wrong, but I want to suggest it's only a partial approximation to reality. The world is much more complicated. And particularly, as we move through the 21st century, it's our interconnections on networks. When we think of networks, we think of the internet, that's part of it, but also our real-life networks, where we're much more exposed to other people's ideas, behaviours, than ever before. So in many ways, copying and whether ideas spread not through autonomous agents making their own decisions, like Robinson Crusoe's, but connected together and seeing what other people do, observing, listening, and mainly switching their behaviour purely on the basis of that, rather than necessarily on a rational analysis of the objective facts. This seems to me to be much more realistic. I mean, just very briefly to say, think how the world's changed. I mean, just 2 points. So first of all, now for the first time in human history, more than half the population live in cities. And 100 years ago, less than 10% did. Now, it wasn't that people didn't have networks in villages, but we're talking like, tens of thousands of years in human history, when in general, most people lived in small communities. And now a dramatic revolution has taken place through the second half of the 20th century. And in cities, we're in London now, you can't help but observe diversities, wild diversities of fashions, of thoughts, of opinions, of behaviours. So there's much more around to copy. And also we see, obviously, the transforming potential of the internet, making us much more aware. So it's a bombardment of information, Eric Beinhocker, in his book a few years ago, estimated that in New York City alone, on any single day, an individual had available in consumer products and services 10 billion alternatives, not million, billion alternatives. So in a world like that, where there's information overload, copying is in fact a much more rational way to proceed. Now let me just give an example of copying. I mean, they're not quite as fashionable as used to be, but everybody here will know about Crocs. The shoes with holes in. So why did people buy shoes with holes? Now, I mean, my hometown is Rochdale, and it's a damp climate. And even there, people bought it. Now, of course, shoes with holes, I mean, you're our old lad, you were lucky to have shoes. But, you know, you think, I mean, it was mad. But it was a fashion, so people just copied it. I mean, people in the street would see them and say, well, I fancy a pair of those. Somebody they never knew, who they were connected to temporarily on a random network, see them and they will copy that. So there's one particular example. Now, switching to something which, in my view, is just as ludicrous, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. Many of you haven't really heard of these, but these have been the intellectual basis of academic macroeconomics for 20 years. And Oliver Blanchard, who was then the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, published a paper at the end of August 2008, less than 3 weeks before Lehman's collapsed. It's a very interesting paper, but he points out that dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, nearly every central bank has one or wants one. It was a fashion accessory of the central banks in the late 2000s. Everybody had to have one of these models. Of course, when the crisis came, we just threw them away and just generally modelled through. But I want to give an example now, another example of I'm going to go back in time to an iconic event in English history, which I think has implications for control or for thinking about spread of terrorism and ideology now. So here is Latimer and Ridley being burned in Oxford in 1555. Here they are. Remember, Queen Mary came to the throne and wanted to restore Catholicism. And there's a particularly extreme sect of Protestantism that had taken control of the Anglican Church. And it does appear from historical documents that that was very recent. So the bulk of the population was still broadly sympathetic to Catholicism. And so basically she tried to get the leaders of the Anglican Church to do a deal and said, look, if you recant, you can keep your positions.
Paul, can I intersect a second? Could you go to the lectern? I'm afraid we're actually recording this, so we need the audio for the internet.
I've just got a point. Well, okay, I'm not going to point.
Sorry.
It doesn't matter. Okay. And some of them did. Some of them fled abroad. So Mary came and said, okay, if you want to keep us Protestants, then okay, you can keep you will be burned. Now that was a pretty strong incentive to switch, right? So we can tell a story. And some did. Some fled abroad. Some recanted, and some didn't. And some of you can see the famous example of Latimer and Ridley. Mary was aware of ideology, the need to combat it, because here we see a preacher, a Catholic preacher, preaching on the text, though I give my body to be burned, if I have not charity, it availeth me naught. So they were aware of the ideas of spreading ideology, of combating it, but they rather hoped that this spectacle would terrify people into abandoning Protestantism. Now, ex ante, that was quite a sensible strategy, and it nearly worked. There was a relatively recent precedent in British history with the Lollard movement, an early form of Protestantism, where a few judicious burnings had done the trick. Now, it didn't work this time round, and ex ante would have been very hard to tell, but it didn't work. We look back and we can think of it in network terms, because the Protestant leaders used two forms of networks. First of all, they used their own network to reassure themselves. They wrote to each other constantly when they were in prison awaiting execution to maintain the faith. They kept close contact to reassure each other, but they tapped into a network. The ones which were burnt, many of them were very prominent. Cranmer, who's waiting his turn in the castle, he was burnt a few months later. At the seventh attempt, he recanted 6 times, and then he finally went to the stake. But they realised they were famous, they were known throughout the land, and we have, through Fox's Book of Martyrs, a contemporaneous book, evidence of their behaviour. They consciously realised that their behaviour at the stake had the potential to reinforce people's belief in the Protestant faith. There are many examples in this book of them writing to each other and saying, through behaving properly when we're being burned to death, our behaviour, it will reinforce the faith, people will copy it. And that's the gamble we are taking, that we're willing to be burnt to death, and as a result, Protestantism will be reinforced. Now, we know ex post that it works. It might not have done ex ante. I think just one comment on this from a point of view of, say, Al-Qaeda, I think if some of their leaders were willing to be blown up as suicide bombers, it might be more effective, it might have more credibility. But that's not for the record. Maybe you can delete this. I don't want to spend following me around.
Yes, we're on the record.
Now, the perception, seems to me, a lot of it is about, in networks, it's not so much, because here's faith, so this was a question of faith. We couldn't actually say rationally which was true. Was it Catholicism? What was the true faith? And in many examples, I think increasingly about the key thing about networks is it is a great deal about perception rather than objective reality. What is believed? What percolates across a network? What gets traction? Switching back to modern times, now we look at, say, UK public debt. I know there's a warning in the papers today. And interest rates on British bonds. Now, as it happens, public sector debt as a proportion of GDP in the UK is higher than it is in Spain. And yet our interest rates are 2%, and the Spanish vary. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 7. So there's a slight disconnect here between objective reality and the perception. And if we think about what politicians and central bankers have been trying to do for the past year in the whole euro crisis, has been to try and get global traction for perceptions about, yes, the euro will be saved, and that's what the battle's been about, rather than necessarily about objective reality. It's about trying to convince people across networks in this particular belief. So narratives on networks are a key feature of economic policy. The British Chancellor has managed to succeed just by making really relatively modest reductions in public expenditure, has managed to convince people somehow that this is credible. And as a result, so British long-term interest rates are 2%. They're much higher in some countries which actually have higher public debt ratios. Just let me give some other examples from the social world. Think about obesity and smoking. There's two, to me, famous papers in the New England Journal of Medicine when two American academics used a database of a town in Massachusetts which had been constructed to monitor people's heart conditions, the heart survey. But purely by chance, it had actually asked questions from the outset about people's friends and family and their health and their behaviour. And they were able to interrogate this database of a network in a small town in Massachusetts and actually follow this through and say, for example, on obesity, if a friend of yours became obese which goes back 30 years, if a friend of yours had become obese, relative to the average, the chances of you becoming obese during that period increased by 57%. Now, it doesn't mean that you copied it, that it sat there and said, yeah, I'll have another portion of French fries, I'll copy my friend, I'll become fat. But in a sense, it sanctioned behaviour. It gave permission for people to carry out behaviour which might otherwise have been socially unacceptable. And similarly, on smoking, the probability of somebody ceasing smoking was dramatically increased by whether a family member or a friend had ceased in this period. Or in the UK, think of binge drinking. I've published a paper where we can show, where we say it is certainly compatible, completely compatible with the idea this is simply a fashion phenomenon. In a sense, it's permissive, it's allowed to behave in this way. But if you're thinking in terms of the rational agents and incentives, then you naturally think of policies of changing the price of alcohol. But if it's a fashion phenomenon, it's more subtle, it's harder to get into these networks. It's harder to think what to do, but if you can crack it and get a cascade going the other way, when the behaviour is then no longer seen as acceptable, the problem will disappear completely. So networks have the power both to reinforce bad behaviour, but also if we can tap inside them to reduce it. Let me just, skipping on, just my other chart, here's an example again of narrative. I'm switching around scales here. Here's total private debt in America relative to GDP. And as we know, this was a primary cause of the financial crisis. Here's the recession in the 1930s, it peaked before. But we can see, even by 2000, the objective facts were that debt was already very high. And yet the narrative was, this was fine. There was not a problem. This was a good thing. The great moderation, economics had solved all problems. There was going to be, I'm not going to quote the source, an end to boom and bust. And we can see, but it goes up and up and up. And there were a few dissidents, a few people saying, oh, no. But in general, their message was swamped. And the majority message, almost, just goes to 2008, it's come down since. But I'm just going, it's the peak here. Somewhere right at the very top, the narrative changed. It spread in a completely different way across networks. Here, everything was fine. A few dissidents, but people believed. Like Peter Pan, exhorting people to believe in fairies so Tinkerbell will live. They believed it was good. And then suddenly, quite quickly, they believed it was bad. And banks completely stopped lending to each other. We had a credit crunch. And then banks believed, then there was a collapse. And the network effect of Lehman's, the idea that it might percolate across economies, there might be a domino effect, completely absent from all the regulations, from the Basel II regulations internationally to regulate banks, which were treated as isolated autonomous agents, simply looking at their risk profile, and the idea of connectivity on a network, that it might cascade, escaped both international and domestic policymakers completely. So the financial crisis was ultimately a network effect. It was a network effect of confidence amongst banks, a network effect of confidence amongst firms, because at the moment, certainly in Europe and to some extent in America, although they've started to spend, many of the big companies that have survived are sitting on massive piles of cash. But they're all reluctant to spend because of confidence on networks. Once that returns, once, if you like, Keynes's animal spirits become more buoyant, they'll start to spend, and we'll see a very strong recovery in the economy at some unpredictable point in the future. So there's another network effect, network of confidence amongst consumers. So we can reinterpret the global economy as a question of different types of network. And just thinking about policy, although there is some movement on this now, I think how technology might be harnessed. The idea of complexity is not no government or less government, much cleverer government. So there's the Financial Service Authority, hailed by Gordon Brown as a world-class provider of financial services and regulation, with thousands of people, made tens of thousands of pages of regulations, completely impotent in the face of the financial crisis. Now imagine, and this is now becoming reality, that we use information technology to gather real-time information on the transactions and liabilities and assets between different financial institutions. We can use these things in a much smarter way. So if a bank is in trouble and it's primarily connected to other banks which are financially strong, you can say, down the tubes, we'll let you go. If the bank is connected to other weak ones, then there's a case for support. So it's really a question of being smarter about government, not no government, better, often less, not a rule bookistic, but clever use of technology and information and thinking would help us design much better policies, much subtler and much cleverer government. And it seems to me, just on my final point, just translating this more generally, there's an awful lot in social problems, an awful lot, there's network effects there. Think of the poor towns of the United Kingdom. Network effects trap them. A culture spreads locally of not being interested in working, in being on benefits. That's one culture, one network. The networks, so say, particularly on local housing schemes, on local estates, they lose their connections to the world of work. The network effect with the outside world atrophies. They don't find out about employment opportunities. And the general perception of the outside world is you simply don't invest there. A problem which I mentioned especially for Claire, who's here somewhere, Liverpool has suffered from decades. That people, you know, it has a bad image. Maybe it's starting to get over it. That's why people don't invest there. So we can think of regional policy as a network effect. But in these areas, there's a lot of tacit knowledge, a lot of local knowledge, a lot of successful networks. There are entrepreneurs, even in these depressed areas. How do we restructure? We can't rely on the councils to do it, or the Regional Development Agency, which thank God have been scrapped. How do we put these together? This is a challenge for thinking, how we challenge into a positive way the positive knowledge that local communities have to revive themselves. And it seems to me if we use networks in the right way, it enables far more to be done, far more to be achieved in social and economic policy. But as I say, it seems to me it requires smarter government rather than more. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Paul.